Hello, everyone, and welcome to the CARE webinar. My name is Sarah Abramowitz. I'm with Ross Strategic, and I'll be supporting this webinar today. We're going to start off by quickly walking through the logistic and ground rules for the webinar. First of all, this webinar will be recorded. The recording will be transcribed and made available online. All attendees' phone lines are muted and are in listen-only mode. The question and answer session, the majority of it will be held after the presentations, so we will make room for a few questions in the middle, but questions can be sent throughout the presentations. You can send those in advance. So there are two ways to ask a question. You can type in the question box in the control panel. If you can't see the question box, be sure to toggle open this section of the control panel. You may type a question at any time throughout the presentation. When we get to the question and answer portion of the meeting, you can also select the hand icon. This will indicate that your hand is raised and that you have a question. If I call on you, I'll unmute you to allow you to ask your question. You will want to ensure that you're dialed in correctly in order to speak. If you're dialed in via a phone, you'll need to have entered your PIN number. If you dialed in via a computer, you'll want to make sure your microphone is enabled. If the control panel is minimized, click this orange button here on the graph tab. I will now pass this over to Joe Mangino to continue today's webinar.
Hey, thank you, Sarah. We're on slide 3 for today's topics. So I'd like to go over some brief background on eEnterprise and kind of an overview of the CARE project. We have some new listeners I can see from the registration list, so I want to cover some of the basic background. And then we'll get into an update, kind of a latest update on the implementation side and that's through the CARE product design team update. And we'll be going through a number of series of research projects and summaries of those that have been completed and ones that are upcoming. And then, as Sarah said, we'll have time for questions and discussion, and then we'll also point to some good contact point information. Just one point on Sarah's note about submitting questions through the dialog box on the webinar. We may not be able to get to all those as we go through, but just know that the questions are recorded and there will be a frequently an FAQ document that's developed afterwards to capture those questions and with responses to represent the answer to those. So if we don't get to it on the webinar, just look for that as a follow-up to the webinar, and we will have some time for verbal questions, as Sarah noted, in the middle and at the end of the webinar. So with that, next slide, Sarah, for the poll question.
All right, so we have a poll that we'd like everyone to take, so I'm going to go ahead and launch that now. That should have popped up on your screen. And we'll give everyone about another minute to answer. All right, it looks like most of the votes are in, so let's give you another few seconds. All right, thank you for participating. And you should all be able to see the results of the poll now and see what organizations are represented on this webinar. All right, I'll go ahead and turn it back to you, Joe.
Great. If we can go to slide 5, please. Thank you. So a little background on eEnterprise for the environment. The CARE project falls under the umbrella of the eEnterprise program. And the eEnterprise program is a collaborative partnership between federal, state, local, tribal groups that are looking at streamlining processes, optimizing technology in a number of different project areas. CARE is just one of them. And it really is a representation of implementing lean processes, which I think people have heard of the term, and new IT applications and services, kind of some of the modern business practices, and get those attached to kind of existing and new programs as they develop. And some of the overall goals are shown here is, certainly to improve environmental results. Another big one is to reduce burden for all stakeholders, the regulators and the regulated community, and to enhance services for the same communities in terms of getting access to data on a timely basis. So it is, as the next bullet says, a kind of new way of working together among EPA and SLTs as state, local, and tribal agencies. And it's, I think it represents a good example of this term cooperative federalism that I think you've heard is a priority in this administration. It really gets to kind of a meaningful engagement and collaboration between the different partners from the different agencies and groups, and really to help develop a regular input and back and forth between those participating members to develop these new processes. And some of the last bullet says there's some of the key enterprise values that are integrated into all aspects of both this project, the CARE project, and the other ones that fall under the umbrella of e-enterprise, or streamlining of processes, as I said, modernization of business practices, and lastly, because of this shared collaborative leadership among the participating groups that's kind of formally embraced in the makeup of e-enterprise, is that there's this trust and accessibility to the regulated community and the co-regulators. So, together those are kind of the value propositions with e-enterprise for any project. The next slide, please. So getting specific to the CARE goals, the basic purpose of the CARE project is to consolidate emissions reporting activities, said here, through modern data sharing technologies and streamlined program collaboration. And one of the ways to refer to it was brought up recently. I did a state presentation, is to promote and create interconnectivity between reporting systems. I thought that was a great term because it really gets to the essence of what this project is about. It's not about creating some giant new mega, mother of all databases, but to create this connections and interconnectivity using some modern, IT techniques and processes. And we'll talk more about what that means conceptually in a couple slides here. So the expected benefits include, as I mentioned, reduced industry burden for point source reporting, timeliness and data transparency, creating consistent information across programs. So that's a big benefit we see through the project. And then data quality, just through the process of sharing data amongst programs, you tend to get to a higher quality level of data. And then accessibility and usability of the data, being able to transfer it in a more timely basis and make it accessible. And obviously that helps decision-making processes too, as shown in the last bullet. So go to the next slide, please. So more on the CARE basics. The focus is right now on point sources, and the 4 point source programs that have been of attention on the work so far has been the Toxics Release Inventory, the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, CEDRI, which is the Compliant Emissions Data Reporting Interface, and the National Emissions Inventory, which you, I think, have heard referred to as the NEI. And that encompasses the state data that moves its way to the NEI and utilized for construction of that. The focus of the CARE project is on emissions reporting, and I say here not facility attributes, which would be like the profile of the facility, like what's the name of the component and the components, the facility latitude and longitude. There's another team under e-enterprise called the Facility Integration Team that's looking at that part of the facility data side. The CARE project is focused on the side relating to emissions, the pollutants, the values for emissions, the controls that are associated, anything that affects the emissions input, any emission factors that are loaded up as well, that kind of information. And the other thing to note on the CARE project is there's continuous collaboration amongst the state, local, and tribal agencies on working on the background and research behind the implementation CARE. And this is just, like I said, part and parcel of the project. So you'll see we have a number of state members involved with and local and tribal members involved with all different aspects of this project, from the leadership vision down to the individual research projects. The focus right now, as said in the next bullet, is on process improvements first, not regulation. So at this point, we realize that to involve regulation changes is a very time-consuming process, and so we wanted to first look at ways to improve, to implement without those types of changes, realizing though that maybe down the road that may be necessary or tweaks in some cases to evolve that, but we're not there yet on what those might be. And then lastly, using information technology. I can't overemphasize the importance of this aspect of the project. When you modernize practices, generally you're talking about electronic processes, and here we're talking about electronic reporting. So it's going to entail development of application program interfaces, APIs, web services, shared services, new software that maybe we haven't used yet or been limited in use. So all under this kind of terminology of technology optimization solutions, if you want a way to refer to it as, is just a very critical aspect of the project. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this is a diagram that I've showed in a past webinar. This is the kind of as-is state of emissions reporting, and if you look at this, it shows essentially, individual silos that an industry kind of enters in to report to for any of the given programs shown there at the bottom of the diagram. Some of these are directly into federal programs like TRI and GHGRP. There's different types of information. For example, in CEDRI, there's test data and compliance information that eventually used for WebFire in terms of creating emission factors. And then you have the whole large component of industry reporting directly to the states where they operate, and that huge amount of data that goes into every given state, local, tribal agency, and then eventually works its way and published in the NEI. So, but at this point, they all kind of are different silos, as I mentioned. And right now, while there is some communication across these, there isn't direct connections between these systems. And this is something that the program is really kind of focused on, is how do you create this kind of interconnectivity from the beginning, if possible, to share information and get it to move across programs in a more ready fashion, as opposed to now where it generally has to be done kind of manually after it's gone all the way through another system. Okay, next slide, please. So here's a kind of a proposed future state concept. And if you kind of look at this diagram in terms of those programs that we just mentioned that exist and will continue to exist, this CARE project is not about replacing any existing reporting system. But if you focus on that middle part of the diagram there about common reporting and the shared platform, that's really where kind of CARE is focused at, creating what we've been calling a common form, which, if you think about it in concept, could either be an actual like e-form, or it could be more of like a behind the scenes application to allow the data to move from programs where it enters and then share it with other programs and possibly populate or put a placeholder into an existing system so that the information can be shared where appropriate. Not all these programs obviously have the same type of pollutants or necessarily the same type of requirements for facilities to report data. So data is reported at different levels. But the idea is to have a platform and through shared services applications and connectivity, be able to share this information. And right now, CARE is kind of focused on the emissions data, like I mentioned. So if you look at that middle diagram, the common form, the emissions data components, the facility attributes, like I said, is being looked at by another program, possibly with the Federal Registry System of Facility Data, where that you can see would be another kind of service application to populate the form. And so this is the concept is how do you build these connections in this type of a shared system, and relying on retaining existing systems and sharing facility data and emissions data where appropriate. And hopefully through this, be able to reduce redundancy and use the best available data point for the emissions. And next slide, please. Okay, here's another diagram. I wanted to show this one. It kind of gives the kind of a perspective that CARE is just kind of one application flow under the e-enterprise umbrella. So I'd like people to know that there's other pieces that create this kind of interconnected system, and it's not just the CARE project, which I said is focused on point source emissions data, but you can see here in a more broad swath about how it interacts with other parts of e-enterprise development. And then from the left-hand side, moving across, you have an industry user entering the Federal Identity Bridge, which again is another project under e-enterprise, and looking at how to develop these identity shared services. And that would then capture that pertinent information. Then that would be connected to both federal and state program interfaces. And then that information attached to industry reporting platforms that then go into this part where we're working on CARE under a common emissions data collected to match that facility, match its profile as it's provided through on the bottom of the slide there, the facility ID management services. And this would be a shared service of facility profile data that I mentioned before. So you can see how then this would create the ability to have a shared emissions data service, which then could feed state systems, EPA systems, and the programs that it needs to go to. Again, this is a conceptual application. This hasn't, there's parts of this that are somewhat in development. The Identity Bridge is a proof of concept. The Facility ID is looking at how it would work with states and FRS data. And obviously, we haven't gotten to developing a common emissions form yet to even prototype. But this to give a perspective that CARE is just kind of one application flow under e-enterprise, and where it would kind of fit in and use some of these other services. So I think that's helpful to some people to kind of get an idea where it fits in kind of this broader e-enterprise concept. All right, next slide, please. So I want to talk quickly about kind of the design of the implementation aspect of CARE, which is where we are right now, and kind of what you can think of as kind of as an initial implementation phase. CARE, by the planning and is a long-term, a relatively long-term plan project. So we're at the part where the product design team, we refer to it as the PDT, has formed around 12 members that consist of both state, local, tribal partners and EPA program staff, along with a number of observers and supporters from other agencies, which you can see there on the slide. So this really gives us some really good kind of leadership and really kind of the hands-on, what are we going to do next in terms of projects and to implement the objectives of CARE overall. So the PDT has been meeting since October 2016 to design and manage these research and development projects that I referred to. And we're following the CARE implementation plan, which, as I said, lays out a multi-year process for implementing. So we're kind of in that, really kind of on the first side of that, that implementation plan. And the key consideration that the PDT looks at is how do the R&D projects support the overall care objectives? And most of the projects also have a kind of a tangible benefit unto themselves as well. So we kind of see that as an added value proposition to improve some aspect of the emissions systems that we're looking at. And we'll talk a little bit about some examples of that as we move forward. And then the general scope and product is designed for each project by the PDT. This helps set up the projects kind of just preliminarily for individual R&D teams then to go and design their own specific steps and their products for the given topic area. Next slide, please. So this is a diagram of the organizational structure of the product design team. So on the left-hand side there, as I said, there's this roughly 12-member product design team that kind of meets and manages a series of projects, R&D projects. And we work off a kind of a priority list that started with the care implementation plan, and we've kind of gone from that and looked at kind of priority topic areas. And they include, as you see, things like, data model design, emission factors, SEC coding, pollutant definitions, QA/QC. That's just some examples. But from that priority list, then we scope out, the PDT scopes out a number of projects, and those design teams, then those R&D teams form around those individual projects, and they usually consist of around 4 to 7 people. Again, a mix of state, local, tribal, and EPA program staff working over anywhere from a 5 to 7 month time period to work through the project steps and develop actual products in terms of reports and spreadsheets, data model design specs, things like that. So at any given time, all these teams are working parallel together with management from the PDT. So next slide, please. So recent accomplishments for the PDT. The R&D teams completed 5 first-round projects in 2017, and my co-presenter here, Michael Burton, will be going through those as soon as I finish up here. He'll be going through these 5 projects, so I'm not going to go into those there, so you can just see them, the titles of those projects. The second round series of R&D projects have been defined and teams have been formed at the end of 2017, and we've started those now in January. So those are underway, and these include some second phases to some first round projects and some new projects areas as well. And Michael will be touching on those as well towards the end of his presentation here today. And again, the key focus is inputs and needs assessment for both the care overall objectives, and one of the next big parts of the project would be a potential pilot project to demonstrate how build and demonstrate how a common emissions form might work in a shared system. And the goal of that is for 2018. So, and then we continue on continued outreach throughout the year of these regular public webinars. We do numerous presentations to state, local, tribal, and industry associations through the year that I know some of you have been at. And then also we really have a lot in terms of education and recruitment of state, local, tribal participants, both for the PDT and for some and for these new R&D teams. So I'm going to stop there, and we'll take. Before Michael goes into the summaries of the individual projects and the next one's coming up, we'll just take a couple minutes to see if anybody wants to raise their hand for a question at this point. Sarah can unmute you, and we'll take a couple minutes, and then we'll want to move on though to the summaries. So I'll stop for a second now for that.
All right, it doesn't look like we have any questions.
Okay, so with that, then we'll move on to the next slide, and Michael, take it away.
Well, thanks, Joe. My name is Michael Burton, as Joe mentioned, and I'm one of the two state co-chairs on the product design team, the PDT. Myself and Mark Wirt from Massachusetts are the state leads for that team. And so, yeah, I mean, as Joe mentioned, about a year ago, we kicked off the first round of these R&D projects, and wrapped them up officially, about the end of last year. So we're pretty proud of the work we've done, and so I'm going to go through just some quick summaries of these 5 R&D projects. I will note that we do have most of their final reports posted on the web, so you can have access to the full report and get all the juicy details if you want. But we'll have those links at the end of this presentation. So the first one is the TRI NEI SLT crosswalk program crosswalk. Back when we were first scoping out the CARE project, it became apparent that there were all of these EPA programs and state programs that were dealing with air emissions data, and as Joe mentioned, there weren't any connections between databases. There wasn't a lot of connections between the programs themselves. And so with the idea of trying to make those connections, the first really step is asking, are these programs, using the same terms and terminology? Are they collecting the same, data? Are they collecting similar data and just calling it, something different? Questions like that really needed to be answered before we moved ahead and started, building these pathways for sort of interconnectivity. And so this team was tasked with, really defining, a program crosswalk between these 3 programs. And, one of the key aspects of most of these R&D projects was, conducting state surveys. So obviously this CARE, program has implications for, the state and local programs as well as EPA, air programs. And, we don't have, a good sort of unified, database or information on what all of these programs are doing. So reaching out, broadly to other state and local programs is, has been sort of a key component of all these to try and collect as much information as we can. And so that's what this team did. They then took, pollutants for each of these programs and, built a crosswalk to see, yes, they're collecting the same pollutants in all these programs, or they're collecting similar pollutants, but they're calling it, one thing in this program and something else in another, just so we know what that crosswalk actually looks like. And finally, producing a report that, kind of lays out, the differences, the areas where, where there are opportunities for combined reporting, and things like that. So yeah, let me have you go to the next slide, actually. So some of the key findings from this team were, one, there aren't a lot of states currently using TRI data in their their NEI submittal or their the submittal to EPA. The 3 states that did, Illinois, Minnesota, and Indiana, sort of have different approaches to how they manage and handle that that integration process. So there were some lessons to be learned from those 3 states, but generally that's not something that a lot of states did. There's as you'll see on the screen, there's a few reasons for not using TRI data. In general, it's a bit difficult because it's TRI air emissions data is collected for a specific purpose in a specific format, and it doesn't it takes some work to get it to work for something like an NEI submittal. So we've documented all of those. We have those in the report. Next steps as identified by this team, is to move forward with looking at producing something like a recommendations for harmonizing both of these systems, producing some type of maybe a draft guidance for how state and local agencies can utilize TRI data in their NEI submittals, for QA purposes, for gap filling purposes, things like that. So so those have been sort of identified as next steps, but again, if you are sort of interested in learning more about the TRI air emissions data, or how you can crosswalk what's in TRI with your state or local air program, take a look at this report. I think even the crosswalk file has been uploaded to the website, so that's available for you to use right now. And as Joe mentioned, I mean, a key component of a lot of these programs is, they sort of move the ball forward on care, but they also produce something that can be used now for state or locals, or for sometimes EPA programs. So I think there's a lot of short-term benefits for some of these projects. Okay, go to the next slide, please. So one of the other sort of big areas where we saw some potential waste or duplicated efforts amongst all these various air programs was in QA and QC. And so the real question is, for a workflow like the NEI program, where a state is collecting air emissions data, they obviously have all of their own QA QC procedures. It then goes to EPA, who has their own set of QA QC. There's probably a lot of duplicated work there. There's probably a lot of checks that are happening twice on the exact same pieces of data. This project is really what are those, and can we combine them into a single step, or can we somehow automate those checks so they're being performed automatically when data is submitted at some point in the process. We really didn't know what what the whole ecosystem of QA QC looked like. So that was kind of one of the tasks of this project. Again, utilizing a state survey, starting with QA QC checks from EPA programs, the NEI program, as well as some of the state and local R&D team members, pre-populated a set of QA QC checks, and then sent that out and asked for states to fill in anything that they do that wasn't on that list. And so really, the end result of this is a fairly I think comprehensive list of the types of QA QC procedures that occur on air emissions data across the whole country, at state, local, tribal, and federal programs. So so that's I think that's incredibly helpful. Let me have you go to the next slide. Some of the key things to take away from this project, or that they found during this project, is in general, there does seem to be a big potential value in integrating these QA QC checks into some type of automated or electronic system. In general, across all the state and local agencies, there's a lot of discrepancy in how QA QC is performed. There are some states that do a lot of these automated electronic checks, but there's some states that don't really do any at all. So there's really a ton of potential benefit in kind of consolidating and harmonizing those checks, especially when we're talking about data that's collected at the state and local level and then passed up to EPA and used for purposes at the EPA level. So, next steps for this project. Taking the compiled list of QA/QC checks, and making that available. And I believe this one is also available on the website. So, if you're a state and local agency and you want to, audit your QA/QC, program or procedures and see, maybe you're missing on some cool new procedure that some other state has found that you want to take advantage of. At least we now have that fairly comprehensive list that you can see what everybody else is doing, and maybe leverage some of that work that's already been done. And then the ultimate step is taking this list of procedures and ultimately trying to incorporate them into CARE, into the common form that Joe was describing in some automated fashion to try and remove a lot of the burden of doing these manual QA/QC checks. All right, let me get you to go to the next slide, please. All right, so the next project is on the emissions data model. We're talking about developing some type of combined air emissions, reporting system. One of the key, foundations of building that is understanding what data, needs to go from point A to point B, or what data elements are being, collected at the state level versus, what data elements are needed at the federal level. And again, as with all the other products or projects, we knew this was vital information. We just didn't have it, so we needed to get it. So again, starting with a list of common emissions data elements from the EPA programs and some state and local programs. We started to compile what would be hopefully a comprehensive list. We then used a survey to send that out to see if we missed anything, see if there's something, some data elements that a state was collecting that was different than everybody else, just so we're aware of what all of those data elements are. The idea is, once we know all of that, then we have, a fairly good foundation that we can then move forward with, a pilot, or, really thinking about what the combined air emissions form can look like and do, because we know what data it needs to handle. So next slide, please. So some of the key findings, one that I was sort of surprised with was that there were many additional pollutants that sort of weren't on that starting list. So it's about 83 common pollutants across all the responses we got from the survey, which is great, because that's those are 83 that maybe we would have missed or not known about. So that's great. Aside from that, really, there's not many additional data fields that are being collected out there by other states that that we didn't already know about, or we didn't anticipate needing to handle in some way. So that's in some ways that's good, and it's not totally surprising, because we're all dealing with air emissions data, and there's not a lot of not a lot of variations that you can do on that theme. So yeah, I won't say the rest of that, I guess, list speaks for itself. I will mention sort of the next steps for this that this team identified. Following up on this, the first round of surveys, reconciling any data element issues for use in the common emissions form. Doing a pre-pilot assessment work. Again, the idea is to to get get our teeth into something like a pilot that we can actually test out and start using. And really, the data model is sort of a keystone a part of any project like that. The other thing that that came up and has sort of been a key issue from the beginning of CARE is how to handle confidential business information, and that was identified as sort of a next step. And as you'll see later on, that we sort of spun that out. So that's going to be its own phase 2 R&D project to just look at how confidential business information is being handled, and what implications there are for the combined air emissions project due to those. But I'll talk about those future projects in a minute. So let me go to the next slide, please. So the next project is the SCC WebFire team. So source classification codes are sort of a fundamental identifier used by the EPA and the NEI to to label and categorize air emission processes. And WebFire is the EPA's emission factor repository. And so in developing something like CARE and something like the combined air emissions form, we need to understand what issues there are out in the wild with state and locals with source classification codes, or with the emission factors, or the ability to use WebFire, or any emission factors that are coming through WebFire. So again, this team used a survey to poll for any issues or pain points that states are having with either SCC codes or WebFire. And so yeah, let me get you to go to the next slide. And so really what they found, for WebFire, there wasn't there weren't a lot of states that were able to directly utilize WebFire emission factors to be pulled down automatically from EPA and then uploaded for use in their systems. States, well, there just wasn't a lot of consistency in how states were utilizing these this WebFire data, particularly inconsistencies in how timely they were able to get any new or updated emission factors into their systems. Some other issues were with pollutants and missing emission factors for certain pollutants, or for control devices that were missing or obsolete. And so there's a few issues with WebFire that the team identified. So in terms of next steps that this team looked at, first was to develop something like a compendium or an associated guidelines for use of state, local, tribal emission factors that can be used by the Common Emissions Form as one of the input databases. So developing something like WebFire, but for state and locals only, that would be separate than WebFire. And then using tools such as the new source classification code web service, integrating that new web service to get errors corrected and updated in folks' systems. So just a couple ideas for next steps there. Next slide, please. So the last of the 5 phase 1 R&D projects is the greenhouse gas emissions mapping study. And so, like the TRI program, greenhouse gases is a separate, federal program that collects air emissions data. In this case, greenhouse gas data. And the question is, for other states or for state and local agencies that also collect greenhouse gas data, how much do their efforts, overlap or differ from the federal greenhouse gas, reporting program? And so this team, didn't do a broad survey this first round, but instead chose to focus on 3 sort of example states that have greenhouse gas reporting programs, and did like a deep dive with a deep dive on the comparison of the reporting programs at each of these individual states. And even I think they chose for each state chose a different source category to look at, and then did a deep dive of the data collected both at the state level and at the EPA level, to see where the overlap or discrepancy was. As I mentioned, they didn't do a broad survey, so that was identified as sort of the next a good idea as a next step for the next round is to broaden that survey. Take what they learned for those 3 example states, broaden it out to see what other states are collecting greenhouse gas data as well. For states that do collect it, what do their programs look like? And compile all those findings and see what implications that has for for care moving forward. Next slide, please. So some of the key findings from this study, the required methods for emission calculations are different between greenhouse gas, GHGRP, the federal reporting program, and state programs. A lot of state programs had lower reporting thresholds than greenhouse gas, GHGRP, and covered a different set of facilities, and also the level of reporting sometimes differs between facility level units, process level reporting, and also again the treatment of confidential business information differed between states and the GHGRP. GHGRP has a very specific way of handling confidential business information when data is being input, and so that's we're going to definitely leverage some of the lessons they've learned from that program sort of as we move forward looking at CBI. So yeah, and I think I don't know if the GHG report has been posted on the website yet or not. I'll need to double check, but again, that one should be, if it's not up on the website, it should be posted soon. So if anybody has needs any more information on greenhouse gas study, definitely give that one a read. Next slide, please. Okay, so moving forward, the PDT is sort of was conceived to move care forward in an iterative fashion. So the idea is we break the work down up into these discrete phases or rounds. We've completed round 1. We did these 5 projects. We got a ton of data back. And what we're doing is, we're learning from these studies, from these projects. We're taking what we've learned and we're applying that moving forward. And so, so building off of round 1, we've now identified, 5 more projects for a second round, which we're just kicking off. Last week we had most of the kickoff calls for these projects. Most of them, well, 3 of them you can see are sort of direct continuations of round 1 projects. There's a continuation for the excuse me, TRI, NEI, SLT program crosswalk. There's a continuation of the data model and the greenhouse gas, mapping study. Again, just taking deeper dives, or in the case of GHG, broadening the scope of their study area. I also mentioned, the CBI procedures, got spun out of the data model. It was originally, marked as sort of a work item for the data model round 2 project, but with the idea that these teams should be fairly narrow in scope and should be able to wrap up in a fairly short amount of time, we thought that the CBI would have made that product or that project a little too cumbersome, so we spun that out and are tackling it as a separate project entirely. And so that's slated for this next round, and also work on this emission factor compendium, something like a companion to the EPA's WebFire that will be a compendium of just state and local tribal emission factors and guidelines for use in the combined emissions form, or for use outside of that. Okay, next slide, please. And so, again, to move forward with developing something like the common emissions form, we've been doing research and data gathering for a while now, and we're really approaching the time where we need to get some IT support to help thinking about okay, what is this thing actually going to look like? How's it actually going to work? Making specific decisions on IT related topics. So that's definitely on the horizon, and we're quickly approaching the need for that, and we've definitely identified that as a need that we need to address fairly soon. As Joe mentioned, coordinating with other care related projects, facility and integrated planning team and the facility ID management team. Obviously, facility data is sort of a crucial aspect to air emissions, and while care is just strictly focused on the air emission side, there are other teams working on the facility side, and making sure we integrate and coordinate with them is pretty vital. So those are the big next steps, especially moving forward again. So we're working on those next 5 round 2 R&D projects, and then sort of contingent on resource availability and all that fun stuff. We hope to make progress on these next steps listed here. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so as I mentioned, most of the round 1 projects have their final reports posted. You can get to it, there at that epa.gov/enterprise website. Go to the product design team link towards the bottom, and you can find links to those documents. Definitely, check those out, take a look. Tons of other resources available on the website. A listserv, if you want to make sure you get notified of future updates or webinars or all that good stuff. Next slide. And finally, some good contact points. Again, my email address is there, Michael Burton. If you have any questions about what I've gone over today, or have questions about just CARE in general or any of the specific projects moving forward, feel free to reach out and give me a contact. We also got contacts for the facility IPT, and yeah, so I think that's it for my part of the presentation. I think we probably want to pause maybe and see if there's any questions. Joe, I'll throw it back to you maybe.
Yeah. Thanks, Michael. Yeah, so we'll open it up. I think we have some time for some questions. So I would use that note to raise your hand in the webinar box, and we can try to answer your question here today, or we can follow up with a response if we can't find the right answer today.
All right, great. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Joe. So like you mentioned, you can go ahead and enter any questions you have. You can either type them out or you can raise your hand. So we don't have any hands raised yet, but we do have some questions that have been submitted. So I'll go ahead and start with the first one. And that first question is, do you have a list of agencies who participated in the R&D teams in phase 1?
Yeah, in terms of, so where the participants came from on the teams, yes, I can share that with who that is. If I can have their contact information.
Okay. Yeah, so we can take care of that after the call then.
Yeah.
All right, and then it looks like Julia had something to add, so I'm going to go ahead and try to unmute you. Just a moment. All right, Julia, you should be.
Hi, this is Julia Gamas. So I was lead or co-lead on a couple of the PDTs, and I think there's just a couple of things worth mentioning. For the greenhouse gas initiative, the slide that you all saw, it listed a number of things that were not, that the state and the federal program didn't have in common, but that's only part of the story. So I encourage anybody interested to go and see the full report for that. What we did find was that while there seemed to be differences, there was a possibility to explore in the future, which was to enter the actual activity data and all the data that is needed to calculate the emissions into the Common Form, and then somehow allow the Common Form to do the calculations, whether one program wants it one way or another. The Common Form would know that, just like TurboTax knows to calculate your federal and your state taxes, and then everything could get sent to the right program. So that is something that was a bigger picture item that emerged. I don't want people to be misled to think that, oh, there's really nothing that they have in common in greenhouse gases, because I'm not convinced of that. But we do definitely need to go explore more states and more industries. And then in terms of the SEC work, it was mentioned that there's a phase 2 where we're putting together a compendium of SECs for the states. I just wanted to clarify that compendium will belong to the states. It will not be an EPA database, and thus we should just be careful not to think that it's either going to be part of WebFire, because it's not, or that it's somehow going to be owned and vetted by EPA, because it won't be. But I'm happy to answer questions regarding that or the greenhouse gases.
Great, thank you. There was one question, follow-up about greenhouse gases. What sectors were studied under the Greenhouse Gas Project?
We had landfills, stationary combustion, and iron and steel. And we had Massachusetts, Minnesota, and Oregon on that team.
Great, thank you. And the next question is, what plans are there to match NEI to GHGRP data elements?
So I'll step in on this one here. Right now, the GHG project is just kind of comparing how the data elements compare, what type of data flows to state systems that have it. So we're in a preliminary stage right now of looking at that, and so there's still an assessment of how they would match up, what the needs assessment is in terms of moving that type of data. You know, would there be a, you know, how might it move to NEI? That's kind of would be something that would need to be decided as a result of this project, if that's a viable, you know, possibility. I mean, there's signs that, you know, some of this data, you know, would be beneficial for reasons. There's an existing GHGR program that collects a lot of data. So I think that's kind of part of the investigation that's ongoing. And, you know, as they do the second phase project, they'll get a better perspective on how that might work and the benefit of that. So, so I think that's kind of a wait and see right now in terms of how that might work or might not work. So I think it's to be determined.
Thank you. All right, the next question is, TRI doesn't cover criteria pollutants. Will they be covered in the project or not?
You mean in terms of the overall the project? I mean, yes. You know, the pollutants that are being looked at for this common form and the sharing of emissions data includes not only HAP emissions data, but certainly the criteria pollutant emissions data that would be part of the that you traditionally would see in the NEI and in state inventories. So I think that's the answer that you're looking for.
Okay, thank you. All right, next question is, what does the FRD EIS project involve? If SLTs follow EIS structure, will this imply changes to SLT reporting data to the NEI via the EIS?
So this is in reference to the FRS EIS project. Is that what? I can't see the question, so I'm trying to.
Yes, sorry. It says FRD-EIS project.
Okay, I think it's the FRS EIS project, I think, yeah. So I'll try to answer. I'm not directly involved with this project, but it's in a kind of initial phase of just first beginning to match up how data in FRS could even be mapped and shared with EIS through some type of, again, a shared service application. So I think right now they're just kind of beginning some of the initial investigation into how such connections might work and be put into place. You know, ultimately the idea would be, as I said, there's a facility data management integrated planning team, you know, working with states to try to figure, is there a way to use, you know, to share facility data that likely originates from state facility management systems, get that type of data into FRS. So now you have kind of a standing service for facility data that's common, that should be common, depending on how any given program defines a facility, may include some components, and maybe not all components, depending on the requirements for that particular program. And then that facility data could feed other programs, and you know, it could feed EIS, it could feed this common emission form and other reporting programs. So I mean, that's conceptually on how it would work, and I don't know if there's I don't think I have the project lead for that project on the call, but there'll be more information becoming available for this project as it develops more. Again, right now, that FRS EIS project is kind of in some early development stages in terms of just kind of how would the coding match up and things like that in terms of making the connections. So I think that answers the question.
Okay, thank you. So for the next question, it's in reference to slide 18. So I've pulled that back up here. And they're asking, do you mean data model or data schema on this slide?
Do you want that one, Michael, or I can take it?
Yeah, I guess I'm not sure what. You might want to take that. I'm not sure the difference between data model and data schema is semantic, or if there's some deeper implications in those terms.
Yeah,
so,
I think, you know, it's more of the data design. So the way, you know, I think they're looking at it right now is, you know, what are the data fields that would be included, that need to be included, that are representative of state and local reporting programs? What fields, how are they defined? How are they constructed? At what level? So I look at it more kind of like the data design, and I don't know if you're using schema to mention that, or I know some people think of data model as something, you know, more than that. So I kind of refer to it more myself internally as just kind of the data design team, if that helps. But I think ultimately it will lead to some type of, you know, kind of more formal data model if around a common form application. So I think that's what you're asking.
Great, thank you. The next question is, why is the SCC service referenced earlier not part of the upcoming R&D projects? My understanding is that the service is not yet complete and that the code set needs additional attention.
Okay, so for that one, if Julia Gamas is still on the call, maybe she can provide the best answer for that. You may have to unmute her, Sarah.
She should be.
Can you repeat that?
Yeah.
Can you repeat that question?
Yeah, so it's, why is the SCC service referenced earlier not a part of the upcoming R&D projects? My understanding is that the service is not yet complete and that the code set needs additional attention.
I am not entirely sure I'm understanding the question, but let me try. So we have an SCC search tool and a web service that allows you to download and search the table of SCCs. As most people know, there's about 9,000 codes, not counting the retired ones. So we've made that accessible to people. What we don't have yet is the ability for people to have the most updated SCC table in EIS. And we have been making lots of progress towards that, but we have a lot of systems talking to each other, and we have all these other things that we have to get done. So that we're hoping will be done sometime in the next few months. As of now, the EIS is able to, EIS and the table in the web search do match. So that's sort of what is pending on the side of the SCC web service and search tool. Now, if your question is related to how the SCCs do or don't talk to WebFire, that's something that if we'd have to take that question offline because it's a little bit more complicated, but basically we don't have the resources right now to really delve into, WebFire. That's the short answer. So I hope that I've answered the question.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Julia.
All right, so this next one, I don't know if it'll be clear what it's in reference to, but it says, how many point sources do you estimate that will include nationally?
Yeah, so again, I think this is part of looking at what the CARE project is about. It's not creating some new database of point sources. it's just working off existing systems. So with any given system, there's a population of facilities that differs from what's in, for example, GHGRP versus what's in TRI versus what's in a given state's inventory system. So that number will vary depending on what system. The CARE project is again, not to create a new system of storing facility pollutant data. It's to connect these systems together and to move the pertinent emissions data around to where it's needed and where it's used.
Great, thank you. So that is actually all the questions that we have received so far, and there aren't any hands raised. So if anyone has any other questions, you can go ahead and submit those, or raise your hand and we can unmute you. It looks like that might be it. Actually, we have one more. So I'd like to hear more about the emissions factor compendium.
Okay, this is Julia Gamas again. So for the compendium, we have a group of states that is currently working on compiling emissions factor data coming from states, local authorities, tribal authorities. So one of the things that we discovered during the survey was that states have, of course, their own emission factors for specific SECs depending on local conditions. And one of the questions in the survey asked that if you had a database, anything from an Excel file to something very sophisticated, if you could point us to where you had that data. And so that's the data we'd like to start using to put together the compendium. We don't think the compendium is going to be, finished and contain all data for all states, in 6 months. But we do think that it will begin to be a repository of emission factors where people can go and look. And if you don't have an emission factor that you need, you might find that another state with, for a similar industry, for similar conditions, might have that emission factor that you need. The idea is for states to be able to share that data and find that data in an accessible place. And then ideally, eventually have a common emission form be able to retrieve that data and put it in a menu that the user could find and select an emission factor for a specific SEC.
Thanks, Julia.
Thank you. And we have not had any other questions submitted.
Okay. If that's the case, I'd also like to thank Michael for co-presenting here today with me and for all the people that listened in. We tried to kind of give you a perspective on the program, the project overall, and some of the diversity in these R&D projects that have been ongoing. There's been a lot of work around these, and we really like to thank all the state, local, tribal partners that have participated, and taken the time to be on these standing teams. Like I said, they're relatively, we try to keep them to like 5 to 7 month periods, but it is a very concentrated and at times intensive effort, and we really appreciate all that work to make this a collaborative approach come together. And as Michael said, there's lots of different pieces here, and we're trying to, and it may look like there's a lot of, different things going on, but there's connections, and we're coming to the point of trying to make those connections and integrate pieces that come from these projects, and hopefully to see that demonstrated in a pilot type project in the future. So I would say just kind of stay tuned for that. And Michael, did you have anything else to add?
No, I think that was pretty good. But yeah, anybody's, from the state or local is, interested in being more involved with anything, feel free to reach out to any of us, and we can help you get, either more informed or involved in one of these projects that you're interested in. So yeah, no, thanks everybody.
Okay, and thank you,
Thank you, Joe.
Sarah.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. Thank you, Michael. I just want to conclude with, there were a few questions about the slides, so we will be posting the slides on the website, as well as the transcribed recording of this webinar. So we can send out a notice when those are ready. All right, thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you.